So I'd like to introduce you to Madeleine Abrandt Dahlgren. She's a professor in medical education at Linköping University in Sweden and a colleague of mine. And also Associate Professor Nick Hopwood from University of Technology in Sydney. And he's also our honorary doctor at the University of Linköping since 2 years, and we're very happy to have you. We met the first time, I think it's 10 years ago in Sydney at the Altogether Better Health Conference, and been working together ever since. So it's lovely to see you here. And I only give the word to you, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Johanna. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to come and give a seminar. And you know very well this research since you've been also involved in it all the way. I'll say some words about the collaboration between Linköping and UTS, because this is a long-standing one. It's been there for more than 10 years. I think it's actually 2 decades now. And Nick had been working very closely with us, as you said, for 10 years. And to say something about Nick and my collaboration, I think it's during the last 5 years or so, we've been involved in research projects on interprofessional learning and collaboration in simulation-based education, both in separate projects and as critical friends to each other's projects, and also in collaborative research. And we typically work with practice-oriented theories as a frameworks, and also practice-oriented research methods such as field studies, video analysis, and stuff like that. And today we had a kind of bold title, but we will walk you through some of our research and hopefully inspire to discussion afterwards. Nick, would you like to add something on that? Or continue?
Thank you. Yes, it's been my privilege to work with Madde and Johanna, and I see some other Linköping colleagues here this afternoon or this morning for you. And I would just add that I think a further spirit of the practice-based approaches that we take is that we're not trying to freeze the world and look at how it is, but actually look at how it's changing. So look, we're always looking at either innovative approaches to healthcare or healthcare education, or the changes in practice that unfold. And we've got a story to tell you here that was prompted by really significant evidence of change over 10 years before we got involved, and now we're trying to understand what's really special about that. So one of the things that a practice orientation helps us recognize is that in work, anywhere we would say in healthcare, regardless of the particular profession that you're in, you always or frequently come up in practice with the question, what should I do? And that you can't just look at a textbook for the answer, or remember your lectures, or the procedures, or the rules. Sometimes, of course, those procedures and rules are helpful, but there is always an element in professional practice where this can come up, where you have to go beyond a rule or a procedure. And it's really important to good quality care, to safety in healthcare, and is even more complex when you have an interprofessional aspect to it. But it's often overlooked in interprofessional education and training. And there's a paper there at the bottom, and Maddie and I will be very happy to send them out to anybody who wishes. Just contact us. We can send some papers that are kind of the basis of what we have to talk about. But we're really interested in these moments in practice where what to do kind of isn't always determined by a rule or a protocol. Now, that said, the thing that Maddie's going to talk about next is a really important protocol that comes up in a very, very important part of clinical practice that we've been studying.
Yeah, our clinical case that we will refer to today is a very particular one, I'd say. It's called shoulder dystocia, which is when a baby gets stuck in the birth canal during delivery. And that's one of the shoulders gets stuck under the mother's pelvis bone. And when this happens, the situation quickly changes into a life-threatening situation for the baby. And the time window to birth the baby alive is between 5 to 7 minutes. And the interprofessional team around the birthing mother needs to collaborate very closely and quickly to resolve the situation. And simulation-based training is often used to train how to deal with such a situation. And there are also attempts to standardize the action needed. You can see in the slide here, the helper algorithm that is recommended that would sort of work as a mnemonic, that's the word we never can say, Johanna, mnemonic tool, as a memory tool. But when we look at the results that come out from evaluations of training of this algorithm, the results are not unified. They're quite mixed, actually. So this is something that we needed to look into a little bit more, and we can go further. So that's the clinical case, and this is also the where we start our research to deepening our knowledge into what goes on in a collaboration around such a situation. And this is from a continuing education program for the staff working in the birth clinic at Linköping, PROBE, Practical Obstetric Team Training. It's Professor Marie Blomberg who leads this program, which is recurring every 18 months. It's a 3 hours mandatory simulation-based training, of which one is a case with shoulder dystocia. When we got involved in this, it was Johanna and myself from the outset, got involved with Marie's program. She had started to look at data collected over the 10 years the program had been running, and could show some quite impressive findings, we thought. There must be something happening in that training that supports practice. When we can see that over the 10-year outcome data that the injuries to the baby were reduced, the use of the helper maneuvers were 4 times increased. Also, they saw improved documentation practice in the patient registration records. And also practitioners showed more confidence in dealing with this situation. So Johanna and I set out to videotape what was going on in the debriefing of that simulation. That's the phase where the participants are reflecting on their performance and learning throughout this exercise. And what we could see there, that debriefing did happen in quite different ways compared to other simulation-based training we had studied, in that it was highlighting very much the relational aspects of practice and creating throughout a kind of joint account of what had happened and a joint reflection on that. So that's where the data that's where the starting point when we wanted to go deeper into what actually happens in PROBE. And that's where Nick also came onto the team.
Madeline froze. I hope she's coming back soon.
Professional.
I hope so.
Sorry?
You disappeared for a while.
Okay, am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. This is our main findings that we will talk about today, that we see that this type of continuing education for health staff fosters interprofessional learning in practice by encouraging what we have labeled 3 connective enactments. And connective enactments link what one person is doing with what other persons are doing in the moment. It's emerging in the moment. And Nick will now lead you further into the details of how our data support these statements.
So these connective enactments, we've labeled them under 3 broad categories, each of which has some subtle differences within it. The first is to do with verbal commentary on practice. The second one is to do with expressing uncertainty. And the third one is to do with directing action. And we particularly like to highlight this one around uncertainty because in a highly charged emergency situation where you're trying to be a proper professional in front of a very worried mother and colleagues, it can be a very difficult thing to express uncertainty when in fact what you're seeking is certainty. But that really speaks back to that issue that in professional practice, what makes it a special kind of practice is in fact the fact you can't always just follow a rule. So the first enactment that connects what one person is doing with what others are doing is a verbal commentary, by which we mean the act of narrating what you're doing. So you're giving words to describe the actions that you're performing. But to be done connectively as well as collectively, it means the others also have to listen to what's being said, and they have to attune their actions. So it's not just enough for one person to speak if they're being ignored. The others also have to be listening and then attuning. And what we're going to do is kind of read through these things. So Maddie will be mainly the midwife and I'll be the facilitator. In this case, the first sentence is one that comes from the actual sim when the baby was stuck. And then the second quote is from the debriefing. So Maddie, will you be the midwife?
I'm putting my finger in. I'm trying to press, and here's the front shoulder.
So later on, the facilitator, Marie, said, you spoke loudly. You, to the midwife, mentioned the front shoulder, and then you, to a different midwife, gave feedback loudly what step you were at. So you, the obstetrician, could directly go in and take the rear shoulder, since you knew what the previous steps were done. It's not always the case that you can see what the other people are doing. And she then reflects that in the past, we hid this, but we know that the experience of patients is that it feels safe if the team are talking about this. What's remarkable to us about this facilitator's comment is how she could link one midwife to another and to the obstetrician and to the patient. This is a really connective thing to do, to label what you're doing in practice. But what's also shown in that quote is that the other actors were attuning to it. The obstetrician could directly go for the rear shoulder because she was listening and attuning. So it's not just a question of stating what's going on, it has to have that connective quality. The second enactment is the one that's to do with expressing uncertainty. And here we have people questioning, people seeking confirmation, and people giving confirmation. And we found that this was a really, really important part of how these teams dealt with shoulder dystocia, and particularly how the facilitators of the simulation encouraged them to practice in future. So Maddie, you'll be the midwife one, I think.
Turn off the drip.
Is it still a contraction?
No, it's stuck. It feels like it's retracting.
Oh, then we turn off the drip. Are we running helper?
Yes.
Is it H now?
No, we're at L.
So here we have at the inner shoulder dystocia, one of the key signs that the baby is stuck is a very hard thing to spot, which is the head retracts slightly after it's birthed. And so in the debriefing, the facilitator is highlighting many times this kind of questioning. You did ask questions the whole time. Sometimes it was yes, sometimes it was no, which was normal. At least you aired and reminded each other. And this example we've shown here is a really, really nice one where you wouldn't go and do the shoulder dystocia maneuvers unless you were certain it was, and it's hard to spot, but it's shocking when it comes. And then, are we running helper? Yes. And checking, is it H? And the answer happened to be no. So these are really, really important acts of expressing uncertainty and seeking clarification. And they came up throughout the practice and were repeatedly legitimized and validated by the facilitator. The third way in which one action in the moment will be connected to what somebody else was doing was through instruction, guiding, and suggesting, which we group together overall as directing action. I'll be the obstetrician this time and Maddie will take over as the midwife. The first quotes here are from the live action and then the second part are from the debrief. So the obstetrician starts off by noticing this same thing. It's pulling back, it's sucked back.
We turn off the drip.
Now up with the legs. The drip is off, right? Now I'll press the symphysis. And then in the debrief, the midwife comments.
It's so insecure in a room where everybody's kind of waiting for everyone else. It's terrible. We've all had this experience.
Watching you work, and that would have been a collective you in Swedish, there was no doubt you moved the hat around. There was no doubt who had it. And when this person says something, we work accordingly. That hat that the facilitator is talking about is kind of who's in command, who's giving the instructions here. So the facilitator was really validating this idea that it doesn't matter so much who is directing the practice, as long as somebody is, and it's very clear who it is that's doing that. So we have these connective enactments. These connect what one person is doing now with what other people are doing right now or in the immediate future. The next level of our analysis, we realized that these three connective enactments were made possible by something that we're calling collective accomplishments. And also that the momentary actions, the connective actions, made those accomplishments possible. Now, I know this is a bit confusing. The connective enactments at the top that we've just gone through are the detailed things of what happens in the moment that rely on individual performances or things that you do. The collective accomplishments, which we're about to explain, are things that you could only achieve together, but they make those three kinds of action possible, but they're also enabled by those actions. So the first collective accomplishment, the first thing that these teams did in order to solve the problem of shoulder dystocia in an interprofessional way was role switching. And they did that in very fluid, unplanned ways that varied from professional norms. So Maddie's going to be the midwife again.
So what did you think? Because I ended up in the delivery position and you ended up with the mother. Sometimes it happens like that. Now we need to get the baby out and do what should be the best for the patient.
And the facilitator confirms, this is a life-threatening situation. So give yourself permission to focus on the situation and don't think so much about taking over another's role, where she meant don't worry about it. The priority is the baby and the mother. That's it. If it means that in this case, midwife 2 does something that the obstetrician might normally do, that's fine. The priority is the safe delivery of this baby in a short amount of time. So that role switching was really important. And we're saying you can't do that without those three connective enactments, but also those connective enactments enable you to switch roles. The fact that you've verbalized means the next person can come in and take over, but also you have to be ready to switch those roles in order to do these things like express uncertainty or direct action. The second collective accomplishment is to do with coordinated and responsive sequencing and pacing. Now, this is really interesting because this is an aspect of clinical practice, the shoulder dystocia, where you'd think the sequencing and pacing are fixed. You have the protocol and you have 5 minutes. So like, who's to go fast or slow? It's got to happen fast and it has to happen in this order. Well, actually, even in a situation like this, the sequence and the pacing of what happens next and who does what is not fixed, is actually an area of uncertainty. And so, Maddie, would you be the obstetrician for us?
I was considering turning the patient. We talked about it. No, I'll try once more. I think we had good communication.
And then in the debrief, the facilitator validates this, just giving each maneuver a little longer, not rushing back for the back shoulder, because that's where the plexus injuries come. So stay on the first ones a bit more. So what we're having here is the facilitator, in this case, praising the fact that they tried one particular maneuver for longer before giving up and trying the next one. What the obstetrician was saying was, if you notice, I was considering turning, which is moving to the next maneuver. We talked about it. No, I'll try once more. So the obstetrician is attributing the fact that she was able to slow down and not rush through to a collective discussion. That decision to set the pace in that way was not hers alone to make, a collective one. And the facilitator is praising that decision, saying, if you rush on to the next move, that's when we start to see more injuries. So we're starting to see the answer now. How has probe reduced injuries? Well, it's encouraged practitioners to collectively set the pace so they don't panic and rush through in what is otherwise an extremely panicking situation. I think the literature says that for midwives, shoulder dystocia is one of the most distressing things that can happen. The third collective accomplishments, so these are the things that only happen together and rely on those 3 enactments, but also enable them, is the production of calm and security, despite the urgency and the seriousness of what is happening. Now, ever since I've done this project with Johanna and Maddie, I've asked every midwife I meet, if I say shoulder dystocia, what comes to mind? And the answer has always been panic. It's just a really horrible thing to happen in practice. And yet, what was happening here was the production of calm. Now, if you're in a team and they're all panicking, you can't make calm. You might be a little bit calm in yourself, but probably not for very long. The production of calm is something we have to do together. And here we have a sequence of comments that all come from the debrief where the team were reflecting on this. So, Maddie.
I felt it was calm and methodological. We all knew in what order we would do things, so it didn't feel stressed.
Something you contributed to yourself?
Oh, I can do the mnemonic, and I need to repeat that out loud.
It will give a kind of security when you, speaking to the nursing assistant, say, it's been 1 minute. That's valuable because you think it's been 10 minutes, but it's only been 1, and it's calming to know. And this was something that they highlighted particularly around the importance not only of timekeeping, but time speaking, so that the team would know 1 minute since the head got stuck and we knew it was a dystocia, and 2. Now that's actually going to help the team not rush on to the next maneuver. If they realize they've still got 4 more minutes, they can stay with those safer and less injury risking maneuvers for longer. So calm is something that's really, really important in an emergency situation, but not something you can just make by yourself. Maddie's just going to give my voice a break and take you through this summary so far.
Yes, and here you can see what we've just gone through, the three connective enactments we were talking about, the verbal commentary, the expressing of uncertainty, the directing of actions that enables collective accomplishments. These are accomplishments that cannot be reached by your own, but a team accomplishment. The role switching in fluid ways, the coordinated, responsive and sequencing and pacing, and the producing of calm and security. So these are how the connective enactments work and what the collective accomplishments are.
So then we now come to kind of try and deliver on what we promised at the beginning in the title of the paper. And we use this language of practice architectures. Now, just like a building is, I guess, like an architecture, the theorists that Maddie, Johanna and I draw heavily from say the same thing applies to practices. Just like buildings have designs and big features, so do practices. And whilst you might think the architecture of a building is its walls and its ceiling and its foundations, the architectures of a practice have 3 different forms. In most everyday language, we think of sayings, doings, and relatings. The architectures relating to those are language and habitual ways of communicating. And we see that here in the commentaries, the asking of questions, the use of specialist terms, like I will apply the suprapubic pressure, for example, and the vocabulary of the helper mnemonic. The architectures of doings are patterned routines of actions, but also objects, material things around in a delivery suite. And so we have the doing of listening. We have the doing of the actual helper maneuvers, pushing here, raising the legs, turning the patient or rolling the patient. And the fact here that the professionals do physically each other's actions. The architecture of relatings is to do with relationships and roles. And here we saw something really interesting, that what seemed to be key to successful interprofessional practice in this particular setting was the permission and the valuing of role switching and fluid leadership. And very much importantly, including the patient in the team. So for example, the verbal commentary, was a way of folding the patient into the architecture of practice so that the mother would know what was happening, or at least get the sense that the team knew what was happening and be part of that feeling of calm in what is otherwise a very distressing situation. Now, these relationships and roles were very obviously not hierarchical. They were all in service of one outcome, which was the patient and the baby's safe delivery without injury. So rather than a medical hierarchy of obstetrician over midwife, over nursing assistant, or whatever order it would be, in this situation, that hierarchy was not the architecture of relationships, although it is a very common architecture across a lot of healthcare. And so this leads us to the idea of practical wisdom, or praxis is the kind of the technical language that comes from the theory that we work with. But this is knowing how to remain focused on achieving the good for the individual patient. And remember, the facilitator was saying, don't worry about who's bossing who around, focus on what we need to do to get this baby out safely and for the mother. So knowing how to do that in the context of practice and its telos. Telos means intention or aim or spirit. So the telos of shoulder dystocia is to get the baby out alive and without injury, and also without injuring the mother. In these very changing situations, how to accomplish that, figuring out how do we do what's good for this patient right now in this changing situation, with all the complexity of different sizes of babies' shoulders, different physiology of the mother and the birth canal, a different team who may never have been in a room together before in exactly that combination, all that situational pressure, all that systemic pressure of 5 minutes until the baby's seriously injured or worse. Knowing how to remain focused on achieving the good for the patient, that is praxis. So whatever that is, the label we use for that knowledge is praxis. And what we found was that probe teaches 4 kinds of action. The first one is the theoretical one, where you might understand anatomy and kind of reflect on why it's good to do something and why the rear shoulder might be more likely to be one that produces injuries. The second kind of practice is technical. Absolutely, probe teaches the use of the protocol helper, and absolutely they do suggest that you follow the protocol in a particular order. The third and the fourth ones are, we think, where probe really makes a difference and why it stands out against other training programs that try to address shoulder dystocia but have not typically had such good outcomes. Thirdly, it teaches the professionals to act wisely, by which we mean through praxis. All that constant reminder of, for the good of the patient, this is why we create calm together. This is why we change our roles and leadership roles together. And this is why we collectively determine the pace and sequence of our practice. That is acting wisely and for the good. They also, and we saw glimpses of this in the data that we shared, interrogate the way of doing things and are ready to transform existing practice. We heard that in the voice of the facilitator saying, we used to just stay silent, but the patient got really distressed, so now we label what we're doing in practice. So that's a critical kind of praxis, which is the readiness to reflect on practice, to change and do something differently. Maddie's going to sum up here. Yeah,
so we're not claiming that the algorithm for actions, the helper protocol, is unnecessary in any way. On the contrary, it remains crucial to probe success. And we see the team referring to the protocol in their interaction. But what is important is that probe also prepares practitioners to go beyond the protocol, to act wisely, as Nick said, in their connective enactments and focusing on what is emerging in the situation. The protocol then becomes not a mere technique or a procedure to be followed, but a tool to transform practice. This is to us suggesting that good interprofessional learning and practice need to recognize and strengthen protocol in this way, and at the same time be based in critical praxis. So here is what we think about as a kind of toolkit for observation of interprofessional collaboration. and what a supervisor, educator, and trainer can do, to think of this as what happens in the moment. What are the connections that happens in the moment as practice is enacted? And try and also to highlight and value the accomplishments, the collective accomplishments, what can only be accomplished collectively in this situation. And bear in mind also all the three architectures that make practice possible: the sayings, the doings, and the relatings. And also to think about how to orient practice to the practical wisdom of patient safety and critical action, to know where to break away from norms and go beyond following rules. So, so this was the end of this presentation, and we're very interested to hear your questions and comments, and whether this toolkit, if we call it that, or it's more like a toolkit for thinking than for doing things in the practice, so to say. But here's the key message again: the connective enactments, the verbal commentary, the expressing of uncertainty, and the directing action, leading to and make possible role switching, coordinated responsive sequencing and pacing, and not the least, to produce calm and security.